getting involved in business relationships with friends and family or associates. And this happens all the time, right? Um, you know someone who knows someone, or maybe you go to church with someone, or maybe you're related to someone um, who can do something, and y'all decide, I'm going to hire that person, or I'm going to go into business with that person, or whatever the case may be. Um, that can be pretty dangerous if you don't really lay out some good ground rules beforehand. So, have you had that experience before?
So I've been pretty fortunate for the most part when it comes to uh, starting a business relationship with friends or family. I have done that on several occasions. They've been minor deals though, and um, nothing too major. I have intentionally declined several opportunities to get into business with friends and family just because of that, because it rarely ends well. There's different dynamics there.
Well, there are different dynamics. I know that I've been involved, and it can be good and it can be difficult. So, for instance, on the good side, a friend of mine and I are involved in this company called Convergent Digital Media. But
I think I know
you
that
know,
guy.
I think you are that guy. Um, but you and I, as we do business together, uh, there are some things that make it work. I mean, obviously, we have admiration for one another, and we have respect for one another. But we also have the kind of relationship where we're able to talk about pretty much anything, and we're willing to do that. And we take the time to collaborate with one another on a fairly regular basis so that we're on the same page. We know what our goals and objectives are. And, there's a means for both of us to agree on how we're going to do what it is that we want to do. And so, in a relationship like that, where the communication is open and where the goals are mutually agreeable to all the parties, um, in this case, we're able to leverage each other's skill sets, so that you can do things that you're better at than I am, and I can do things that I'm better at than you are. And then hopefully together, we can make this better than it could be if either one of us were trying to do this alone. Now, the flip side is if you get involved with someone and you're afraid of hurting their feelings, or they're afraid of hurting your feelings, that to me is like the first major red flag, right? I mean, if you can't talk about the things that you're going to need to talk about, it is inevitably going to lead to disaster. And so, you got to be careful about that, because everybody has an agenda, because everybody's trying to go somewhere, everybody's trying to get something done. When I say everybody has an agenda, that isn't necessarily a pejorative. Everybody should have an agenda. But in the case, where like you and I are in business together, our agenda is a mutual agenda, and we're both trying to accomplish the same thing, and we're working together to that end. If you don't have open communication, you may find yourself in a situation where you start to deviate a little bit, and one is heading this way and another one starts heading that way a little bit, and then there's gonna invariably be conflict because you're not both trying to reach the same objective. And then that is further exacerbated by difficulty communicating. So if you and I, for example, got to a situation where, I wanted to go this way and you wanted to go this way, well, we're going to sit down and we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to decide after we work through it, should we go this way, should we go this way, or should we chart a new course? But we're going to agree on what it is that we want to do before we start moving in that direction. If you don't have those open lines of communication, you might find yourself in a situation where you drift further and further apart. And, at some point, the only outcome is going to be a bad outcome. So that's a huge issue. And another huge issue is you don't really always know people as well as you think you do. I see a lot of people, for example, who look for business collaborators in places like their church. Well, you really need to be careful about that too, because you may assume from your mutual involvement in an organization like a church or a Rotary Club or some sort of organization that you have common goals, common objectives, and common values. But if you haven't actually talked about those, you may find that you don't have as much in common as you think. You may also fall into a trap where you kind of assume something about their skill set or their expertise that might not be accurate, and you don't find out that you're wrong about these judgments that you're making until you're in too deep. Right. And then again, it leads to a painful outcome. So you've been wise to be leery about getting involved with those sorts of situations.
Yeah, I consider
Surely,
it
though, you've
more
seen
lucky.
other people do it, right? Or maybe you're related to people who have done it. So what kind of experiences have you had?
Yeah, I have had several people close to me that have been in situations like that. I've got a real good friend of mine um, that's done it on several occasions, and it was one time it was family, and another time it was friends, and it's painful to watch, and it's painful to experience. And I want to kind of elaborate a little bit more and add a couple things to what you were just talking about. Communication is huge, like you said. But there's two other items that I'd like to bring in an equation, and I would like everyone to consider before they enter a relationship, a business relationship with any partner. And two things are, and these two items missing from beforehand are a big reason I think of why people have a lot of issues. One is boundaries. You and I have discussed that before, and people just don't understand the limits, understand the boundaries. And there's a great book written called Boundaries that I think everybody should read before they do that. I think everybody should read it in general anyway. But
Oh, yeah.
the second thing is kind of goes along with boundaries is defined roles. So when you and I started Convergent Digital Media, we sat down, and among other things, we defined our roles, what we were going to do. What did your role look like? What did my role look like? And I think that's lacking from a lot of partnerships. I don't think
Mhm.
they discuss beforehand what they expect out of the other one. So what happens is when you get into that business relationship, no one really knows what their role is. So they're kind of stepping in each other's path quite a bit. And that's what makes it a little bit uglier.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you can actually see that too with assumptions that are made across the spectrum. Like, for example, if you get involved with someone and you think they're going to commit 20 hours a week to your project and they end up committing 5 hours a week, you're going to be left sorely disappointed.
Yeah.
But, if you never really hashed that out beforehand, you don't have a reasonable expectation. You just made an assumption, right?
Exactly.
I think a good rule of thumb is either put it on paper or make sure that the understanding is sufficient that it could be put on paper. Um, it never hurts. In fact, I advise operating agreements in a lot of situations like this as well. Um, if you're going into business together, for example, but if you're doing business, like if you're hiring someone to do handyman work for you or a contractor or anything like that, or, accounting, stockbroker, any of these sorts of professional relationships that you might enter with an acquaintance or a friend or a family member, um, having a contract is actually a good idea so that everybody understands exactly what you said. This is your role. These are your obligations that you're committing to. This is my role, and these are my obligations that I'm committing to. And that way, if there are any questions or if there are any differences of opinion, um, you've got something to refer back to. But I even would go another step further than that and say, just have an idea of how there would be reconciliatory actions if they're needed. Like, how are you going to come to an agreement about moving forward?
Yep.
Too many times I've seen this with family members myself where, they have a rental house, for example, and they've got a neighbor who's got a kid who needs to rent a house. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, they're my neighbor. I don't know them very well, but surely they wouldn't do me wrong. And so they go ahead and they do the thing and they get hung out to dry and they wind up with a terrible tenant. And they don't talk to their neighbor anymore, but it really wasn't that big of a loss, right? Because they were never very close to begin with. Um, that's not a good excuse not to do your due diligence. Background investigation should have been done, a credit check should have been done, all of this stuff, even if it's your neighbor's kid, or maybe especially because it's your neighbor's kid. But
Yeah.
doing that sort of due diligence is important because you don't want to lose relationships because you didn't do the stuff that you should have done to begin with. Life is too short, I think, to have
Yep.
strain in your family and strain with your friends and your colleagues and your associates. Some people can't go back to their church anymore because of hard feelings with people that they did business with at the church. So don't be that person. That's kind of the moral of the story. So do you have it?
Yeah,
Do you
you're
have
right.
some more thoughts you'd like to throw
Yeah,
in?
I agree. Yeah, you bring up an interesting part of that. The you know family, most of the times it's just not worth losing that relationship about writing it down. And I stress that, it can be a beautiful thing. You're right. And in a small percentage of times, a family, you get into business with family or friends, it can work out great as long as you utilize each other's strengths correctly and know your boundaries. But it reminded me of something in the real estate business when you were talking about having a way to settle any differences you may have, mediation, whatnot. And it made me think of leases in the real estate business, or any contract, really, for that matter, on a even residential commercial property. But a lot of times when people try to do a deal without an agent, a buyer and a seller, and they don't have a professional or state approved lease they're working with, they forget certain things, or they don't know that certain things should be involved there, like mediation or how to solve differences. Well, that is one of the items in state approved leases and contracts. It dictates to you how a situation is going to be resolved. So once something happens, there's no question mark, right? There's no room for feelings. There's no room for interpretation. And you're not trying to figure it out. Once it happens, there's something you can go back to on paper and it tells you how to handle it. And I think that is hugely important when you get into a business deal with somebody.
Agreed. And I know we live in a society where a lot of folks are averse to conflict, but and this is betraying my age, right? But I'm with Barney Fife on this. You got to nip it in the bud.
Yeah. Agreed.
When
I
you see
agree.
problems, take care of them while they're still small problems.
Yeah.
Have those conversations while it's only slightly awkward. The longer
Yeah.
you wait and the bigger the problems get, the harder it's going to be to deal with
Yeah.
those sorts of situations. So, they can spiral out of control quick if you're not careful, and you don't want to lose everything, including your relationships, because, you're not willing to have a slightly unpleasant conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and you'll find that when you can tackle these things together as a team, you actually build better working relationships and stronger bonds. Adversity really can bring out the best in people, as long as you're collaborating in the right way.
The Purposeful Podcast.